Okay, good afternoon. So thank you so much for inviting me. I have to say that I'm here by complete miracle because I participated in a Zoom discussion in New York yesterday. I'm in Berlin right now, and the discussion was from midnight until 2 a.m. My time. So at 3 a.m. I went to sleep, and I was hoping to sleep quite late. And when I woke up at 20 minutes ago, miraculously, I checked my email and found out that my presentation started in exactly 50 minutes because I was assuming for some reason it's tomorrow. So I took shower, rushed to the breakfast room of my hotel in Berlin. Here we are. Luckily, it's Berlin, it's November, it's not too many people. Nice ambient music, and here I am. So do I understand correctly that my presentation should be about 20 minutes? Is that correct? Yes. 20 minutes, yes? Okay, so I'm going to start. So I will talk about 30 minutes. Great, perfect. Okay, so my presentation will be perhaps a bit unusual, given what you know of me. Many people think of me as a media scholar, a new media scholar, but in reality, I'm a visual artist. I was born in Moscow, Russia in 1960, and we immigrated with my parents to US, to New York in 1981. And since the age of 13, I started to be trained in visual arts, both kind of modernist painting and also classical drawing. And this was a bit similar to the system which still exists in Asia, where in order to enter an art school, in my case it was architecture school, you had to pass exams. In my case, in classical drawings, drawing classical Greek heads with all the rendering, all the textures and perspective and the likeness. So I got this training. And when I came to New York in 1981, and I spent some years in New York University Film School, and then I started to work with computer animation and computer graphics in 1984. Right? So almost 40 years ago, I started to work with computers, and then eventually I got a PhD in humanities and visual culture. And when I was teaching for 20 years, first on the East Coast and then in California, and I was teaching the Department of Visual Arts, right? So most of my teaching in my life was with artists, for artists, teaching practical studio classes. Even though I was evaluated by a university based on my writings and based on my books. And then 10 years ago, I moved to New York and became professor in a PhD program in computer science and also data science. So now I teach computer science students. So I haven't done any traditional, I haven't done any actual drawings or paintings for 32 years. Right? So I kept drawing and painting into my 20s. When I stopped around 89 or 90, and then spent 30 years, let's say, participating and helping with transition from analog to digital, from digital to computational, and today, let's say, from computational to AI. And last year, I felt it's time for something else. Now that the digital has become the default, I mean, every single person writes about digital culture. I felt maybe, I can add something else to my activity, something else to my life. And I went back to drawing. And literally 2 weeks later, Midjourney came out, Midjourney released publicly its service, and the generative media revolution has started. And as we all know, the last 15 years has been remarkable. The Chinese companies also have been releasing their own versions of these applications. But in the West, as we all know, we have ChatGPT, we have DALL-E 3. Now generative AI is integrated into Google search. So if you use Google search, you get generative summaries. So definitely we are in the beginning of a new computer revolution. And many people, including myself, believe that the scale of this revolution is definitely comparable to the development of the web in the 90s, and I would say probably the rise of photography in the 19th century. So in my presentation, I will say some things about visual generative media, but I will illustrate my presentation with my own images. So in the last 15 months, I created, like many other people, lots of images using AI. In my case, it was about 16,000. I create images in series. So each series has a theme. Sometimes it's a lyrical theme, sometimes a conceptual theme. And I show this work in a number of group exhibitions. And at the moment, I'm preparing 2 personal solo art exhibitions. One will open in 2 weeks in Portugal, and the second will open in December in Seoul. So as I talk, right, I'll be showing you my own images, and you'll see there's a connection. Okay. So the first part of my talk is called the aesthetics of fragments. The aesthetic of fragments. I've been making images with AI tools every week for the last 15 months. In some of them, you see interior spaces which appear to be made with combination of tools, but of course these are all simulated tools, such as pen, etching, engraving, ink, and so on. The spaces show shelves filled with endless objects. The strange spaces remind you simultaneously of a book library, a warehouse, natural history museum display, perhaps also European still life painting tradition. In between shelves, we see walls, and these often feature nuanced, delicate, often barely visible patterns, some two-dimensional and some three-dimensionals, like patchwork of lines. Switch to something else. Just a moment. Just a second. Yeah, perfect. Okay. Sometimes they appear abstractions, but often they appear to suggest something definite, some objects, shapes, meanings from a human world. What are these fragments? What are these undefined, unnamed objects positioned on the shelves in between? Sometimes we see lines, and it's not clear if these lines are two-dimensional, if they're part of the drawing, or if they're three-dimensional, and they enter our physical world. Sometimes they're more definite, sometimes they're less definite. So you get a kind of aesthetics of fragments. Yes, these are fragments, but of what? In the regular art museum, we see fragments of ancient civilizations, pieces of vases, glasses, plates, and also small tools, statues, and so on. Like the other day, I was in Austria, and we went to a local art museum, and we went in the basement, and we had thousands of fragments of various civilizations, 1,500, 1,800 years ago, displayed in cases, and really get the sense that museum or many museums are these collections of material fragments. But artificial intelligence fragments have different ontology. AI extracts patterns from hundreds of millions of images and distributes them across trillions of connections. So here I'm referring, of course, as you know, to a process of learning, how we train generative AI with deep neural networks, right, where the networks are given hundreds of millions, or in some cases billions of images, and also their descriptions embedded in HTML code, and then we analyze them in terms of pixels and find patterns such as lines, edges, but also perhaps details, ways of representing something, faces, like we don't know exactly, but we know this process of fragmentation goes on, but also dividing and reassembling, and then these patterns are distributed across trillions of connections of artificial neural networks. You can say that in this process, digital materiality of images is further virtualized, evaporated, diffused, but still preserved. And the generated fragments you see in my images are like sands, invisible movement of slight wind, or periodic movements of the ocean edge, leaving traces on the sand. These are fragments of fragments, in our words. I mean, you're wondering, right, why Lev is not commenting with figures he presents with his images, but what I'm really interested in is the space, right, with kind of endless still lifes, right, sometimes recognizable objects, this array of details, and sometimes what I like when AI generates unintentionally this kind of fragmentation where you don't quite know what it is, right? Like what are these objects on the walls? What are inside these images? We don't know, like here. So these are fragments of fragments, deposits of already broken forms, perhaps more fragmented than the 18th century ruins admired by Italian painters and visitors on the Grand Tour to Italy. They're not glitches, and they're also not the noise of telecommunication networks theorized by the mathematician Claude Shannon, right, the celebrated father of mathematical theory of communication from the 1940s. So this is not glitches, no noise, it is something else. The artifacts for one possible AI aesthetics is distributed knowledge and distributed vision. The future internet protocols invented over 60 years ago in the late 50s by Paul Baran suggested breaking whole messages into pockets to transmit them over distant networks more reliably. Breaking something into random parts paradoxically assured its survival. Now, Paul Baran published first description of his pocket switching concept in the 1960 when he was working for Rand Corporation in the US. And as you know, his idea of pocket switching was became later one of the foundations of the internet, right? And its precursor, ARPANET, which began in California in 1969. And the idea was that we are in a Cold War, and there's going to be sooner or later attack by Russia and probably inevitable nuclear war. It sounds very familiar because 60 years later we're back in a very similar moment with Mr. Putin kind of, right, exiting the nuclear test treaty and periodically threatening the world with nuclear bomb. But anyway, let's go back to 1960s. So the idea was that this war will happen, and then, how we're going to communicate, the government, military, and so on. So we're going to create this network, and paradoxically, Paul Baran showed that if you can break message into parts, into pockets, and then send these pockets, and then these pockets can travel independently, and then they can be reassembled at the final point. Even if you take parts of this network, you will still get most of the message. So that was the idea of pocket switching. So internet was partly, I mean, he was not the only author of this idea, but it is partly the internet was born as this, right, amazing idea that to survive a future nuclear war. To survive Soviet aggression, we'll have to break messages into parts and fragments. But in the same years, two Ukrainian mathematicians, right? So Ukraine was part of the USSR, Alexei Ivanenko and Valentin Lapa, two Soviet mathematicians working in Ukraine, invented another fundamental method for using fragments of a message in a productive fashion. Of course, I'm referring to a fundamental invention. They invented the concept and mathematics of deep neural networks. Right? This is not often discussed in official histories of neural networks, but you can go to Wikipedia or various articles, and it's discussed there. So the deep neural networks were invented by two Ukrainian mathematicians, also in the early 60s. They published their work in 62, and then there was a whole book in 66. Their invention was the first deep network, which eventually led to contemporary massive networks with also use of generative AI. Breaking cultural artifacts during learning into fragments such as image pixels and parts or words, and processing these fragments in stages eventually allows these networks to acquire knowledge that can give us infected text, music, spaces, code, and images. In short, by breaking historical human culture into fragments, we get our new generative AI culture. The wonderfully coherent texts written by apps such as ChatGPT are predicted one word at a time. This blind language computer, so to speak, can't see far ahead beyond one word, but somehow one word is associated with another, and the second associated with third. Putting with threads forward gives us poems, stories, cover letters, layers, documents, textbook chapters, computer programs, and so on. The history of digital media and also the history of human civilization is in a serious need of ethereal fragments. Because, of course, we know that in digital period, right, in digital media, the computer represents things modularly. Right? It uses modularity. This was one of the principles of digital media discussed in detail in my book, The Language of New Media, now translated, right, and available in China as a few years ago. So this idea of modularity, the image consists of pixels, the 3D space as represented by computer consists of particle objects, polygons, and so on. But now with AI, we have a new type of fragmentation, right? The networks, as I said, fragment images, text, 3D models, and any other data given to them, even in the process of learning, extract patterns, and these patterns, which we don't know yet how to visualize, so we can't look reliably inside the neural networks, but it will, I think, become possible, distributed across trillions of connections, perhaps, although it's not clear, similar to how human brain works, this is what allows the network to synthesize these new images. So these images are on purpose, right, kind of prompted AI, prompted the journey to create the scenes full of fragments, and then later realized that they can use this as a metaphor to talk about AI. So as I said, the history of digital media and also the history of all human civilization is in a serious need of theory of fragments, a taxonomy that will establish that there are dozens of such species. So here you also see this beautiful kind of fragments, this beautiful neural noise, so to speak, on the walls, and sometimes making books, sometimes making bodies, but it's all fragments, right, which are pulled together. Certainly others have thought about such taxonomy, and here again I recall 18th century European aesthetics of ruins is one example. Calculating the progress of modern science in its pursuit of for elements of matter such as molecules, atoms, and elementary particles, 19th century European artists begin to earnestly fragment the visible world. Impressionists broke it into separate colorful brushstrokes, George Seurat, Polysiniac, light mechanical looking irregular dots. Later in 1905, 1907, another group of artists called divisionists used small square brushstrokes, a new version of pointillism. Another crucial next step was taken by Paul Cézanne around 1878. He declared that all shapes should be represented in terms of a cylinder, a sphere, and a cone. But paradoxically, this seeming solidification of reality was simply new and more extreme way to fragment it. While Impressionists visualized fragments of our perception, Cézanne fragmented the world itself. The tablecloth in his pictures, such as, for example, the card players 1892, is no longer a single continuous piece of fabric. Instead, it's a set of fragments, a collection of flat planes oriented in multiple directions. In 1905, let's say somewhere between 1905 and 1929 and 1931, the aesthetics of violent fragmentation came to the center of visual modernism in Europe, in Moscow, Berlin, Prague, Warsaw, Lodz, Paris. We see it everywhere, in collages of Picasso in Prague, cubism of Jean Metzinger, Glazes, Leger, Delaunay, and others, Cubofuturism of Natalia Goncharova, Alexandra Extra, Lyubov Popova, Malevich, and others, photomontages of Hannah Hoch, Maholinage, Rodchenko, film montage of Werther and Eisenstein, and even cultural history montage of Walter Benjamin unfinished Vercade's project. The latter has led to many interpretations, but suggested even more theories of cultural fragmentations. In time, I think people theorizing AI, maybe me or maybe you, right, the next generation of AI theorists, not media theorists, not new media theorists, not data theorists, not software theorists, but AI theorists. I'm sure some people in this room may suggest equally interesting theories of network fragmentation that forms the basis of generated media today. And it's essential that if you're going to theorize AI media, you get your hands dirty, you learn computer science, you learn to program these networks yourself, because the only way to theorize this media is to become deeply materialistic. And most of humanistic sort of generalizations about digital culture are completely meaningless, because these people, first of all, afraid of technology. Secondly, they understand that they're becoming more and more irrelevant. And thirdly, because they simply don't know how these things work. So please get your hands dirty, so to speak. Get into the garden of connections, convolutions, pooling layers, mathematics, and so on. So perhaps we even will see giant visualizations of unimaginable resolution, showing all patterns extracted by deep networks from their image databases. But as an artist who was always interested in digital aesthetics, I'm just happy to be generating my own idiosyncratic image spaces, which I'm showing you here. I like this kind of painterly kind of drawing like qualitative spaces, and I like this convoluted bodies, and I have my own secrets of how I get these images. But what I'm really interested the most are the spaces themselves, the strange libraries, the books spilling out all over. And I do specify in my prompts things like artists working in their studio in Beijing in 2005, or Seoul 2013, or Shanghai 1995. But I also have other tricks, and when I see these strange spaces, the spaces of culture, but also the spaces of fragments. So the conclusion of this fragment, what I presented. The history of human culture is one of slow forgetting and very rare, almost statistically improbable remembering. Famous artists, writers, politicians, and simply personalities commanding attention every day disappear from our records. And for the lucky few who are remembered, it's only for a few things. Right? Like, for example, when people meet me, we say, oh, you Lev Manovich, you wrote the language of media, but I also wrote 190 articles, gave 800 talks, made 50 or 100 art projects, written and published 15 books, but already I'm only remembered for this one book, and I'm not sure for how long. Right? An artist's work over 60 years is reduced to a few iconic images. A writer's work during his whole lifetime is reduced to one book if he's lucky. So I'm lucky. History compression is brutal and uncompromising. The mechanism of fragmentation and selective recombination and synthesis offered now by generative AI is perhaps less brutal. Of course, to qualify for possible remembering via deep neural network training, something has to be lucky to have been digitized to begin with, right? So something has to be digitized, something has to be captured, something has to be available on the web, and then perhaps this object, this artifact would be lucky to get swapped when the computer scientists are downloading a web and feeding it into the neural network. So I'm thinking of a painting in a small museum in a town that had no tourists visiting for the last 4 years, and maybe it got lucky because it's in the background of a selfie taken by a local high school student and her boyfriend visiting over a weekend. But the painting next to it didn't get lucky. Yes, we get fragments anyway, but perhaps these fragments are more numerous than what more restricted human memory and more brutal print culture allowed for before. After all, the Stable Diffusion has been trained on over 5 billion images, so perhaps your selfie or your drawing you made when you were 14, which is available somewhere online, is also inside. And this more forgiving, less binary process of forgetting and resurrection is perhaps the best aspects of AI aesthetics, its historical kindness. And I want to conclude by saying something else. I posted this on social media a few days ago, because now, like, read those articles, how like artists in the West are resisting, with their works are used without their permission, etc., etc. And I think I like to be paradoxical, right? So I said, this is you kind of lucky, right? So if your images ended up in a training data set of a huge neural network used for generative AI, you're lucky, because in a way you'll be remembered. You entered this museum of fragments used for generative AI training, and then when our artists, designers, and our practitioners of culture industry are generating the images, spaces, concept art for video games, architecture, and so on, your pixels indirectly because every image, right, generated with AI doesn't quote directly from existing images, right? It kind of combines things over trillions of connections. In fact, it has been estimated recently that we look at the images generated by one generative AI network, and we found out that it only quotes directly existing images, something like 6%. So this idea with the images directly showing up in images of our people is absurd. I said, maybe you should feel lucky when you're entering this new museum without walls, right? This museum distributed across trillions of connections, and ending up feeding the new mechanisms, the new imaginations, the new creations. So I'm going to stop here, and perhaps we'll have some time for questions and discussion. Thank you.
非常感谢马诺维奇教授的精彩演讲。 那么接下来最后一个问题，我们想留给场上的观众朋友们以及我们的嘉宾，有没有什么想问马诺维奇教授的问题？那么我们可能最后就是留一个非常小的问题，我们有在 Slido 上面收集到的问题，但是我想提前提醒一下马诺维奇教授，就是我们的时间比较有限，然后可能您只有大概7-8分钟的时间来回答这个问题，那么我现在来说一下这个问题，就是这位朋友提问到，想问马诺维奇先生，在更多的情况下，艺术家其实也是普通人，也会淹没在新媒体的洪流当中。那么，普通人应该怎么面对 AI 的洪流呢？谢谢。
Well, I think that the ordinary people and also artists are benefit tremendously from AI because remember that AI is not only generative media, it's also simply a way to speed up and to make efficient everything. So if you're typing something on your phone and your phone recognizes, the letters you want to type with AI, again, I'm sorry that the examples which come to mind to me are from like Western software, things like Google, because I don't live in China, although of course I'm aware of, Tencent and all the Chinese companies. So if I mention something Western, please forgive me. Just in your mind, please use your own equivalents. So AI is kind of feeding everything, right? AI is also feeding search. So part of AI is that it's like a way to speed up things. And then another important thing is, I think one of the best statements I learned about generative media, generative AI, is by the CEO of NVIDIA. And he said, the revolution of AI has to do with the fact that now everybody can program. Right? Before you had to learn programming, you had to learn coding. So maybe it is, Pascal or C or C++ or Python. It's like a special language. But now you program by simply saying something to the computer, right? So saying something to ChatGPT or to other applications, including the equivalents. You develop the companies in China. So everybody becomes programmer. The programming, of course, allows you to control things, to communicate, to enable worlds, to create new media. So AI brings huge benefits to society. Now, we also know that the countries are worried that AI may have some unintended consequences, and with regulation happening in Europe, US, and China. And in fact, it's quite encouraging to see that China is in the forefront. China has been most aggressive in a good way to regulate AI. Whether it's possible to regulate any technology today, I'm not sure. I think any technology has good and bad consequences. And if you want to have good consequences, you will have a bad, but we should try to regulate it for sure. And I'm happy to see that China is trying to do that. But in general, I think technology has more good things than bad. As a source of information, as allowing people simply to find jobs, to find channels of interest, allowing people to create. I mean, simply the pleasure of using generative media tools, it leads to play, something which lots of people don't have in their lives. So people, I think, are benefiting tremendously, and I think the intellectuals have to wake up and realize it, and make their theories a bit more similar or a bit more connected to what people do. China has been remarkable in its economic progress, and also the world in general. Between 1990 and 2010, 40% of people living on this planet moved from being in the extreme poverty to living no longer in poverty. And in fact, because of progress in Asia, and especially economic progress in China, the middle class in the world has moved from 700 million people, let's say in the mid-90s, to about 4 or 5 billion people today. And this happened because of capitalism and because of technology. So capitalism, technology, and now AI are the most progressive, most positive forces we have. And I think intellectuals should stop critiquing capitalism, should stop critiquing technology, and realize that this is what leads to social progress. Of course, capitalism doesn't only have positive things. Capitalism has also negative things, but everything is. There is no such a simple thing. So this is kind of my message to everybody, including participants in this conference, because I noticed that there are some people who are really upset with capitalism, but you are here in China because of capitalism. You're flying on the planes because of capitalism. You have internet, you have food on the table because of capitalism. And we know what the attempts to build communism in the 20th century have led to. We know that because of its attempts, hundreds of millions of people died, including perhaps hundreds of millions of people in China alone. So AI capitalism is what I preach. And this is my kind of message, my manifesto, so to speak, is to open our eyes to reality and to make theories of society, culture, and technology, which would make sense to ordinary people and not only to each other. Thank you.
非常感谢马诺维奇教授的回答。马诺维奇教授给我们了一些非常崭新的思考，就是让大家从那种悲观的对于 AI 发展的一种非常悲观的前景当中，把我们拉出来，然后给我们提供了一些非常乐观的对于未来的畅想。非常感谢，再次由衷的感谢马诺维奇教授精彩的发言以及对于问题的详细的解答。那么因为时间实在是比较有限，然后呢，我们不能够问到更多其他的问题。所以说我们今天的会议到此就结束了。非常感谢各位嘉宾以及各位观众以及线上的各位观众朋友们的踊跃参与。